Biomechanics and occupational injury prevention is our episode topic. My guest is Dr. Michael Callahan, a paramedic and a registered nurse who is board certified in emergency nursing. Mike has been on the forefront of conducting research that explores ways to prepare nurses both physically and mentally in preventing musculoskeletal injuries, with a particular focus on back injuries, and is one of the only nurses in the world that specializes in biomechanics research. So let's get started.
Welcome to the BRG Nurse Executive Podcast. BRG is a global consulting firm that helps organizations in disputes and investigations, corporate finance, and performance improvement and advisory. BRG's healthcare performance improvement practice offers multidisciplinary services to healthcare organizations. We focus on implementation with innovative, independent, and data-driven solutions. In the BRG Nurse Executive Podcast, we discuss improving patient care by advancing nursing leadership. For more information about BRG, please visit thinkbrg.com. Now here's your host, Nick Shimalewski.
Mike, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So you're a PhD prepared nurse that specializes in biomechanics. And just for some level setting for myself as well as all of our listeners, can you define biomechanics and then also share your story on how you got into this highly specialized field?
The textbook definition of biomechanics, it's the study of the mechanical laws relating to the movement or structure of living organism. As I apply it, I'm looking at the motions of workers. So we do motion capture. I have a 3D motion capture system, and I also look at EMG, which tells me about the muscle activations, and it allows me to see how the participant is moving and a little bit behind the why they are moving in that certain way. Through that, we can predict injury patterns based off of those movements. How I got into it, I personally have a back injury. When I was with the fire department, I injured L5-S1, had to have surgery for that, and recovered very well from the surgery. About 10 years later, I re-injured my lower back. And knowing how the healthcare system is, it took a while for me to get back in to see the doctors, and I was in pretty much excruciating pain. At the time, I owned a gym and talked with a friend of mine who also was a personal trainer, and we developed a workout program that took me from being in excruciating pain, I couldn't sit still for even a 15-minute span, to being pain-free within 2 weeks. And I said, there has to be some research out there on this. And we couldn't find any. So I started really diving into the injury prevention piece for emergency workers specifically, and found that there's not a whole lot out there. So I said, when there's nothing there, maybe it would be a good idea for me to find this stuff and put it there so others can benefit. Through the years, I've worked with a lot of emergency nurses doing exercise and strengthening. And within a couple of weeks of them starting to actually exercise and work out and learn how to position their body, they've become pain-free and they feel much better after a shift. They say they feel more focused. I've really tried to take it where we put the science behind what we've seen in the gym and the work. That way we can apply it all across the workplace.
So you said that the literature is somewhat limiting and you're trying to fill that gap. That's more related to proper techniques, though. I'm just wondering, how big of a problem are occupational injuries from poor biomechanics?
If we look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, nurses are always between the top 5 and top 10 most injured occupations out there. Musculoskeletal injury is one of the leading causes of injuries for those nurses, with back injury being the leading cause. Back in 2016, Dr. Bacharach did a study looking at the use of transfer devices like slide boards and those types of things. And during that study, she found that 80% of the torque that's placed on the lower back is related to the positioning of the nurse while they're doing the movement. That's all pressure that's going just because of poor positioning. which will definitely lead to more injuries. In 2011, Dr. Collins from NIOSH, the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, actually presented to Congress that the way we're teaching nurses to lift is outdated, using antiquated methodologies and not really incorporating any of the lifting devices that are available. But yet today we're still teaching the exact same methods that we taught prior to 2011. So there's a lot out there that actually pulls in these injury rates and injury risks to the nurses. That's a problem we've known about for decades. We've dumped millions of dollars into trying to solve that problem, yet healthcare workers are still in the top 5 most injured occupations out there. So my approach is slightly different to really improve those body positions while utilizing the equipment that's available. I say to my students all the time, engineers have great ideas and they have great solutions. Nurses have problems, but no solutions. So when we can pull everything together and get out of the normal silos of research, it allows us to really address the problem with a given solution.
Yeah, you hit on something interesting, which is the literature that's out there and it not translating really into practice. And that kind of goes to a larger issue, which is not just within occupational health, but more of just the academic to practice gap in general in the nursing profession. What are your thoughts around that? And because if that's the gap that we need to bridge, how do we go about bridging that specifically for you and then maybe more broadly?
I'll probably get in a lot of trouble for saying this, but among academics, we have, especially nursing academics, we have this thought process that publishing in open access journals is predatory, it's a problem, we shouldn't do it. So we publish in these academic journals that only academics have access to. So we have to correct that somehow, either through broadening our publishing with open access or some of our hospitals starting to get access to some of these academic journals. It's great for me to publish a paper in a high tier journal that nobody but professors are going to have access to and read. It doesn't do anything for practice. I've heard as much as 17 years is the bench to bedside practice gap among nursing, but yet we're continuing to do the same thing over and over again. We perform a study, we publish it in an academic journal. Our bedside nurses don't have access to that. And they're not going to pay $35 to get access to a journal article so that they can better their practice. But I think it really broadly is we're going to have to start making our research accessible to those people that are going to use it. And open access has been a venue that I've used, still with high impact factor journals, still high quality journals, but it's a way that I've been able to get some of my work out, as well as going to conferences and presenting at conferences, have all been great ways to actually get people to present or to read what we're doing and see what we're doing. I know I think it was 2017, I presented at National ENA conference about workplace injuries and ways to better position yourself. And through that, I mentioned like a JLo movement. And even last year in Denver, I had nurses walking up to me and going, "Hey, you're the JLo guy, aren't you?" We've been doing that, and it makes us feel we're not hurting as bad when we leave work. We feel much more solid. So it's really nice just to be out at the bedside and get what we're doing out to those nurses.
So you got to tell everyone about the JLo movement. This is audio only. I'm not sure we can do a dance while we're recording this session. And if we do, it'll just be the two of us laughing, but give it your best go at trying to explain what it is and the benefit that it can bring nurses.
We start it with core stabilization. We always tell people to tighten your core whenever you're going to lift, but we don't really show them how to. So I was reading in Dr. Kelly Starrett's paper, or actually his book, Becoming a Supple Leopard, which is a very strange title for a book, but he goes into in the book, he talks about how a leopard doesn't have to stretch. They're just always ready. They can be laying in a tree. They see that antelope or whatever across the prairie, and they can just jump down in 0 to 60 in no time and catch it. He said, that's how we have to be as workers or as just people, individuals. So he developed and talks through a strategy to tighten your core. So he says, standing, feet shoulder width apart, shoulders back, squeeze your gluteus muscles together as tight as you can, and then take a deep breath. And during that exhale, tighten your abdominal muscles. From there, you can go ahead and release your gluteal muscles, and you have some core stability there. And then we can put a percentage on that. So if I'm doing a heavy lift, I have a 250-pound patient on the floor that I'm going to have to pick up and move. I can get that maximal contraction of that core, have everything tight, and just lift them. When I'm walking around the nursing unit, I should always have some level of muscle activation. Because if I know I'm picking up the 250-pound person, I'm going to be tight. If I'm walking down the hallway with a 90-pound older female patient, I'm not really expecting to have much activation. We see most of our injuries occur in that mid-range weight bracket. It's not those heavier patients because we're always ready for them. It's that mid-range to light range patient that causes a lot of our musculoskeletal injuries. During the presentation, I went through that whole process. I made everybody stand up there in the conference room. And then I had them just do a squat while holding that nice positioning. We always tell people to lift with your legs, not with your back, but nobody ever tells people how to do that. During the movement, the first thing that you do is you push your hips back a little bit. The way I was able to pull that together was J-Lo. I'd have them go through the squat technique and they'd say J-Lo real loud. It keeps them much more tight and they can really feel the activation of those leg muscles during the movement. I've translated this over. I actually teach my undergraduate students the same thing and make them yell out J-Lo whenever they go down. And that's actually how they'll correct each other while they're in the lab. They'll see one of their classmates do a movement improperly and they'll go, J-Lo, J-Lo. And it's really it's a fun way, but they also are learning from it and recognizing that, because if we don't teach these new nurses how to lift and how to move, they're going to fall apart. Most injuries happen within the first 5 years of practice, and I want to preserve them as long as we can.
Thanks for sharing that. As you were talking earlier about the academic to practice gap, and you mentioned open access, what really came to my mind was this is really an equity issue. Gosh, if I'm an employee at an academic medical center, I probably have access to these journals that are readily available. And my ability to educate myself and the resources that are there might be different when I'm working in a small, rural, or critical access hospital that does not have those resources for a variety of reasons. How do you think, as researchers in a profession, we make that transition to making things more available on an open access format? And to be clear, there is a cost associated with that. Normally, you're talking $2,500, $3,000 or $4,000 that needs to be paid for by the author themselves or through a funding source they may have to put it out like that. So, what are your thoughts around that?
It is very difficult because there is a cost associated, and we do have predatory journals out there that are in it for profit. They'll publish anything that's sent to them as long as you send them that check. So as an academic, I have to dig really deep into any journal that I'll submit my work to, because you don't want to submit to a predatory journal. That's just a very negative thing for a career. Coming up with the funding sources, NIH is now moving that everything that is funded through them, they want it to be open access, whether that be through an open access journal. Here at my current institution, we can put anything we publish into a repository, which is open access. You can Google search and find stuff in our database. And realistically, that's what a lot of nurses are going to do at the bedside. Something's going to come in, they're going to sit down at the computer and pull up Google and try to find the answer. Now, if that Google document is on a close, it goes through where you have to pay to get access to that article, nurse is just going to bypass that and find one that they can Google search and read through Google. A lot of the universities have those repositories that we as researchers should make sure that we go ahead and put those into those repositories. That way they are open access to other people, and we're bypassing predatory journals. So those are just a couple methods.
So let's circle back to occupational injuries and preventative strategies. You talked a little bit earlier about really two opportunities. One is proper lifting strategies or lifting techniques, and the other really is education, just education around the strategies. But what preventative strategies beyond that have been developed over the years for implementation, and what are their strengths and limitations that exist?
So one of those is going to be your zero lift policies. A lot of healthcare institutions are putting in policies that say you're not allowed to lift. You're not allowed to do any manual lifting of a patient. That's all well and good on paper, but I take care of real life patients, and it's hard to not manually manipulate that patient and move them. So while the policy is a great thing in recognizing that it's a huge risk, it's not very realistic when our patients come in. So I see this as an ER nurse. I see it a lot when the patient first arrives to the hospital. They come in, they're on an EMS stretcher that's only about 30 inches wide. It's up in the air, and they do not have a lifting device underneath them. So there's really no way I can log roll that patient up on their side without flipping that EMS stretcher over. So it's difficult for me to place anything under them to do that move. And realistically, coming from large level 1 trauma centers where they have 50 or 60 departments that are delivering patients to us, not realistic to put those on every stretcher out there. So those policies, that they have their strengths. There are actually some states, there's 11 or 12 states that have laws that mandate not lifting patients. So no manual manipulation of those patients. Interestingly enough, a lot of those states have higher injury rates than the states that do not have those policies. I think it's an underreporting issue, not necessarily that those laws are causing more injuries. I think those laws make it where nurses feel more comfortable to report those injuries. Any other study that you look at, upwards of 90% of the nurses will report some type of pain or musculoskeletal injury. So I think it's really just a reporting issue when you start looking and putting in those policies. Another strategy that's been used are lift teams, to have just a dedicated team of people to lift patients and move them. It's a great idea, but we all know that you get into a busy hospital or even a busy emergency department, you don't necessarily have time to wait on that lift team. And that lift team, you get a 700-800 bed hospital, that lift team is going to run all day long, all day and all night, because we're constantly lifting and moving patients. So just the personnel, having the people required to do those lift teams becomes problematic, becomes a limitation on those types of systems. Then we get into engineered devices. So we have mechanical lifting devices. We got into that a little bit with the EMS stretcher. We have some that are portable, that you can just roll them up to wherever we need them, more of a Hoyer lift type thing. And Hoyer is just one of the brand names. There are multiple out there that are great, but you have to have a lifting harness underneath that patient. Unless we set the bed up prior to the patient arriving with that lifting harness underneath them, we have to manually manipulate that patient. We have to roll them up on their side, stuff this under like we would be doing a draw sheet or any of that stuff, or a linen change. So we're still having to manually manipulate those patients. Then you get into the issue of having enough personnel to actually safely use those pieces of equipment. I read another study that even when using mechanical lifting devices, around 60% of the time, the nurse is in a bad body position. So we're still using bad ergonomics or bad body posture during those lifts, those movements. Going back to what Dr. Collins said when addressing Congress, we're not really teaching the nurses how to properly place these things. If you look at a lot of the instruction manuals for getting the lifting device underneath the patient, it just says position underneath the patient and doesn't really go into how am I log rolling that patient, how am I doing that safely. So there's still limitations there. We look at transfer devices like slide boards, even the cotton sheet. We look at a friction reduction. Using just a simple slide board reduces the level of friction down to 25% of the original amount of friction that's there. Just the cotton sheets that we use for our transfer sheets cuts it in half to 50%. So using some of those simple devices may be one of the best ways for us to go, especially in emergency medicine where we don't necessarily have those lifting devices. I've seen it in operating rooms, some of the ICUs, just transferring that patient from one bed to the other when we don't have that lifting system that's there. One of the limitations of that is, have you ever tried to find a slide board in the ER? You know, you'll have one or two in the whole department, you have a 60-bed unit, and it becomes a little bit cost prohibitive to have one in every single room to be able to transfer those patients. That becomes one of the limitations. Plus, you still have to have 2 or 3 people to do that movement. Even with that reduced friction, you're still having friction. Average size of our patient has seemed to go up over the last decade. A 300-pound person is still 300 pounds, and we're still pulling them across to the bed. So we're still having to put that force in there. We get 3 or 4 people on one side to be able to pull. That reduces the amount of pull that each individual is having to make. So that becomes a limitation with those devices truly being beneficial to the nurse.
All right, so let's assume I'm a chief nurse in my hospital and I'm interested in reducing occupational injuries in my organization. What recommendations and do you have, and really where should I start? I've talked about some strategies, but like where should I first start in moving forward?
My thought is the first thing you want to do is actually talk to the staff on the unit. Find out what the hard movements are. Find out what's limiting them from being able to use this equipment that we've bought. It's easy as a nurse executive just to go out and purchase a bunch of equipment and say, oh, this is going to fix my problem. But if it's not really what the staff needs, then it becomes a huge waste of money. I always tell my students, it's easy for me to sit in my ivory palace of academia and dictate what goes on out in the world of nursing. But unless I'm at the bedside, I don't really know what the problems are. So it's hard to come up with that solution. So I would say the chief nurse, maybe through delegation, because a lot of people would be intimidated when the chief nurse comes down to talk to them, but a unit specific type thing.
The chief nurse should get down on the unit and really find out what the problems are. Figure out where the barriers are for being able to use the equipment. It may be that we need more people. It may be that we have too much workload to be able to take the extra couple minutes on each patient to do the movement properly. So there may be a need a lot more than just throwing new equipment at the problem. And we have to be realistic. Equipment is great, but if people don't know how to use it, it's useless. So we need to not only invest in mechanical lifting equipment that's going to be adequate for our staff and for our unit specifically, but we have to invest in training our nurses on how to do those movements properly. Another big thing that I see in a lot of industry is fitness. So a lot of industries will throw out there, oh, you can get a gym membership, a discounted gym membership. But a lot of our nurses do not really even know how to utilize that equipment. They don't know how to directly approach going into the gym and lifting. It can be very intimidating. And that's whether it's male or female nurses, either one can be very intimidated walking into a gym. So providing the access to personal trainer specific to a nurse could become huge. I'm here at the University of Alabama. We've got a decent football team down here, and our football players, they train very specific depending on what their position is. A running back is going to have a different weight training regimen than an offensive lineman is because they have different skills that they need. And being able to tailor workouts to a nurse and the demands of a nurse allows us, we use the term industrial athlete, and we really need to apply that to the nursing profession. Train the nurse for the injuries that we're normally seeing and for the jobs that they're required to do.
Just using your analogy, would those needs potentially vary depending upon the type of bedside practice that you're doing? So that maybe if I'm in an ICU, my exercise regimen may be different than if I'm a med surg nurse?
May look a little bit different, but we all have those common movements that we do in nursing. The log roll of a patient, you're going to have to do that no matter what kind of unit you're on. That horizontal, that pulling that patient up in bed, that's a movement we're going to have to do no matter what. So I'm currently doing some analysis on different nursing movements. We're using the motion capture as well as EMG to see those muscles that are getting involved. By analyzing those movements, we're actually coming up with a lot of the same muscles are being used for each of these movements. I can focus in on subscapular stabilization, which is that the rear delt and upper back, because we're doing a lot of pulling movements. That's being identified across the spectrum, no matter what you're doing. We're always using the legs. Core stability is always going to be there. So there are some basics that we could do that would address all across the nursing spectrum. But you're exactly right. An OR nurse is going to have different movements than a rehab nurse.
So some of these studies don't have applications in occupational injury alone. You also have a sensor system, I understand, that's being used to predict falls in adults. What's that about?
I work with an electrical engineer. He actually developed the sensor system, and I've helped with location of sensors and different clinical applications of it. We've published 3 manuscripts off of it so far, and we're able to accurately predict the angle all the way of the lower extremities, all the way up to L5S1 with between 80 and 90% accuracy, just based off of the differential pressures across your feet. So we can use that for either injury prediction among workers, but we're also looking at it among older adult population. We're still in the developmental phase of that, so I'm not going to get too deep into that, but it's a wearable technology can become very predictive. We can look at angles, we can look at joint cadence, we can look at different balances, balance points, those types of things, which have applications in multiple different groups. We work with athletes with some of it to pick some of these things up. We work with the older population. We work with occupational setting, all with predictive for injuries and falls. And I really think I meet a lot of nurses that shied away from technology, especially in research. I get a lot of PhD students that they want to stay away from using technology because they don't fully understand it. I don't fully understand everything about our sensor system. I'm not an electrical engineer. Nurses bring so much to the table that we have to be willing to step outside of our comfort zone and realize that there are people that specialize in other things, especially when we're dealing with the engineers. Engineers speak a totally different language than nurses do. But through some sitting down, communicating, having that patience with each other, we can really develop what we need to know between each other. I said it before, engineers have solutions, but they don't have problems. Nurses have problems, but we don't have solutions. So it's a perfect marriage between the nurse and the engineer, and really getting outside of our comfort zone, because a lot of nurses are not comfortable when we start talking about this high tech and different technologies. But we have to, if we want to make a difference and really change the progression of healthcare for nursing specifically, we have to get on board. We have to have our seat at the table. Otherwise, engineers are just going to build stuff and they're going to throw them at us and say, here, this is what's going to fix your stuff. Nurses have to be at the table.
Any closing thoughts as we wrap up this episode?
Facial injury among the nurses, especially the musculoskeletal, it has to be multi-phased. There is no Band-Aid solution that's going to be out there to fix any of the problems. But if we don't fix the problems with nursing or with musculoskeletal injury among nurses, it's going to lead to more burnout among the nurses, more nurses that have to leave the profession. We're going to have worse patient outcomes because if I'm distracted by an injury, I'm not focused on good clinical judgment and nursing care. And at the end of the day, I want all nurses to go home safe. That's all any of us want. We come in, we want to do our job, do it at a high level, and go home safe. We want to go home in the same or better condition than when we got there. We need to take care of our staff. And we can do that through preparing them mentally, but we also have to prepare them physically to do the work of a nurse.
Mike, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today. All things biomechanics and occupational injury prevention. Really appreciate your time.
You've been listening to the BRG Nurse Executive Podcast, which focuses on improving patient care by advancing nursing leadership. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the host and podcast guest and do not necessarily reflect the opinions, position, or policy of the guest employer, Berkeley Research Group, or their other respective employees and affiliates.